Examples of some faddish trends in evangelical theology over the last few decades are the following. Normally, the evangelical theology tends to copy what liberal theology disregards or discards. We can have examples in the so-called process theology, the idea that God is not a stable being, already defined in himself and eternal, but rather is a process, is a God who becomes and changes and evolves and morphs according to how the world goes. Or another example is open theism, the idea that God doesn't really know who he is and is an open-ended being, and so he can turn in one way or in another depending on the circumstances of history, of human reactions, and so undermining the idea that God is the eternal God and his attributes are stable, are always the same, he doesn't change, and he governs history rather than being subjected to it. More recent faddish trends include the emergent type of theology that pays a lot of attention to a seeker-sensitive culture, wanting the church and therefore the gospel to adapt to what people expect them to be, to the point of compromising fundamental tenets of the gospel, like the fact that we're all sinners, that our sin is a radical problem that we cannot solve. And that is another example of the way in which evangelical theology has had the tendency to compromise. Even more recent ones have to do with the so-called new perspective on Paul. The idea that Paul was basically wrong in his, or actually the interpretation of Paul was basically wrong in ascribing to Paul the idea that we are justified by faith alone, and by justification by faith alone, we mean the fact that God imputes the righteousness of Christ on us. The new perspective tells us that this is a wrong interpretation, and so we need to repackage the gospel in such a way as to dismiss everything, or almost everything, that the Reformation has taught us in grasping what Paul's gospel was all about. So there are several examples, and evangelical theology has had the tendency to, at times, to be over sensitive and over open to these trends, rather than just examining them biblically and rejecting them to the extent in which they would undermine the biblical gospel.